Hello and welcome to Taking Liberties, episode 33 of season 2017. My name is Lee. I'm in Western Australia, joined, of course, always by the two fantastic gentlemen in the chat, which is Vickers and Zeev.
Yo.
Hello.
And this week we're gonna cover quite a few things. I think we've got a few things to talk about. We've got the ACTU's come out in favour of a living wage. Which is really just an expanded minimum wage. So we're going to talk about that. We've got the ATO is coming up short on money. There's like political campaign funding, and there's also like the Paradise Papers because rich people apparently are evil because they put their money in Singapore instead of, you know, wherever else they should put it. So we're going to try and cover a bunch of those tonight. So first off, we'll start with the minimum wage and the ACTU
living wage,
which is really just the minimum wage but more. So the ACTU has come out in favour of this. Essentially, it's a minimum wage pegged to living standards only. So apparently, the Fair Work Commission.
To the median wage, to the statistically found minimum wage in Australia. 60% median wage. 60% of the median wage, as discerned presumably by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, will be the new minimum wage from year to year in Australia. That's what they're saying.
Yep.
I mean, that's on the face of it from the newspaper reports.
Yep.
That's interesting because theoretically, I actually don't mind that calculation because if the median wage, presumably if it's a median wage given by, if the median wage happens to be a public service wage, the living wage will not have increased for 5 years. So, I mean,
it works like that.
No, that's not how it works, I'm afraid. It does represent.
No, but I'm saying right now, I reckon the median wage is probably held by a public servant somewhere, just because they've got this large bulk of incomes in the top 50%. Well, between the 50th percentile and the 95th percentile, it's littered with like public service APS levels. I would not be surprised if the median wage was held by an APS 4 in the federal public service. I would not be surprised if that was the median wage.
Sure, but they're not going to. And
if that's the case,
right. The numbers always count, but nevertheless, I think any one of these things is going to be a lot higher than the current standard. So, just going off sort of the rough information I was able to gather through searching the internet, you're looking at like 48 grand a year. So the median wage, I think, is in like 2013, 2014 was 80 grand a year. That's the median household income in Australia. So that's
sure.
Can I interrupt? Jump. Sorry.
Go for it.
Hold on. Can I interrupt? To give you an idea, okay, right now the minimum wage, if you worked full time at the minimum wage today, you would earn $36,400 per year. Full-time before tax, okay? If you worked the median wage, not minimum, but median is $78,000 right now. 60% of that is $46,800 per annum. So, in effect, the union movement is saying that... the union movement is saying that the minimum wage needs to be increased by... about a quarter to a third, somewhere in between there, from where it is now, which is an incredible increase. Oh, yeah. And I think it's something that needs to be talked about because this, it could really impact small businesses quite dramatically. I mean, there are a lot of family businesses out there that just hire people internally from their own family to get away from the minimum wage in Australia, and they just don't hire people, particularly on the weekends, because you face additional penalty rates. That is to say, the weekend wage is about 25 to 50% higher. 25 on a Saturday, 50% higher on the Sunday if you're working in retail or hospitality, and what that means, in effect, is that it's not viable for many small businesses to hire people on those days. They just have to have the family work there instead. And that's the scenario where this minimum wage increase is happening. small businesses at the margin, that is to say small businesses who are struggling financially, will make a decision either not to open on the weekend, or they will make a decision to reduce their staffing, that is to say to do their own the business owner himself will do his own shifts at a lower cost to himself, or they will just shut down because they can't afford to keep running anymore. So,
or they'll just do what Canberra does and do a 50% surcharge on Sunday. That's what happens here.
Well, if they can afford it, if they can keep getting the business in on that basis.
Yeah.
And I think the other point to bear in mind is that this is actually a radical break from where the union movement has historically stood about the minimum wage as a concept. In Australia, the union movement has always said that some bureaucrat in Canberra needs to determine the minimum wage after having regard to a bunch of evidence put forward by the unions and employer groups. And that's been the case for about 100 years or more. That's the industrial history of the concept of the minimum wage in Australia. You get a federal court judge and a bunch of union and business appointees sitting on the Fair Work Commission, and they determine the minimum wage in their divine wisdom and foresight. And what they're saying now is they can't do it. That for 100 years they've been doing it. We introduced this system, the union movement. We've been so proud of it over the years. We introduced it again in 2007. In 2007 we ran on defending this system against the evil John Howard. And now we're getting rid of it in favour of a static figure. 60% of the minimum wage is what. Of the median wage, rather, is what every worker, so to speak, is entitled to. It's a remarkable turnaround.
Not all that surprising.
I'm not quite sure. In some ways, it's not surprising because the union movement has failed to get 60% of the median wage as the minimum in Australia, right? I mean, because the people at the Fair Work Commission, which the Labor Party has appointed for the last 6 years, from 2007 to 2013, it was Labor Party appointees being put in to run and staff the commission. They weren't willing to do it then. The ones appointed under the Liberals weren't willing to do it from 2013 to the present day, and I think it signals a broader shift to the left of the union movement, that they want this to happen now, because the union movement has never actually called for such a radically high minimum wage. Pardon me.
Yes, they have. They've consistently called for it. No, you've missed. So anyone in the union. Anyone in the union movement would be happy.
I would say. Not in this way, though, because they've always said we need the experts in charge to determine what it is, and the experts in charge consistently consist of Labor appointees who don't set the minimum wage that high. So they've always played this kind of two-faced game of we want it high, but not quite that high. It just depends who you talk to and at what time and which closed doors you're sitting behind.
Okay, This is incorrect. So no, this is absolutely incorrect. So what actually happened?
Quite correct.
It's yeah.
What I'm saying is they've always had this approach of the. Oh, sorry, Vickers, go on.
Yeah.
No, so this is an absolute misunderstanding that goes on by effectively what's put out by the APA. The Fair Work Commission's purpose is not to serve the union to push up the minimum wage. The Fair Work Commission's purpose has always been to decide what is the appropriate wage in a given industry. They've never, the union movement has never claimed control over Fair Work, right? That's one key aspect, right? The other aspect is the union movement has always argued for higher minimum wages. That's been consistent ever since Fair Work. Yeah, ever since Fair Work Australia came into place. Even before that, they've been consistently arguing for minimum wage. There's no sort of tie-in between Fair Work Australia and the request for a minimum wage. And quite frankly, Where? Right? Because they've been asking for it irrespective of Fair Work Australia being in place.
They've been asking for it for a long time, but they haven't been. First of all, the 60% figure is new. 60% of the median, that's a new thing. Okay, that's a relatively new thing that they've been pushing for. Okay, the second point to make is that the ACTU is a Labor-aligned union, and the Labor Party has been appointing union members to the Fair Work Commission. Now, you may say that it's not the role of the commission to do what the union says, but the fact of the matter is that it reflects the personal views of senior union members who are being appointed to the Fair Work Commission and setting the minimum wage below what the union, whom they perhaps at one point represented only a few years ago, was calling for. So you can see how it's a bit of a two-faced, one thing for the public, one thing for the business community / the inner circle of the elite, right?
So, I mean,
that's all I'm saying.
Having said that, I mean, like, I'll just...
I'll let you finish.
Because we're going to talk about 4 different things. I mean, I think part of... Like, you got to remember that the ACTU is a lobbying organization. So even if they want this thing, they may not be making this point to actually get... I mean, I'm sure if they could get it, they'd have it. I mean, that's a huge win for their members. Because the thing is, people who are unemployed don't get to be part of a union. So, like, the ACTU is essentially lobbying for people who are going to benefit from this thing and not for those who get fired. Especially given that, you know, most of the people, like the mum and dad businesses you're talking about, Zeev, they're probably not going to be in a union. The unions only represent a very, like a fraction, like it's like 7% of workers. And I reckon a lot of, in say retail, it's going to be around Coles, it's going to be around Woolies, like the big employers where they've got cozy relationships with the sort of constituent unions.
With the SDA, yeah.
Yeah, with the SDA. So, I mean, I think this could entirely be like pressure, you know, like they want to go out to say, oh, we're campaigning on behalf of our workers. We want to have this thing. They don't get the thing, but they get something kind of like the thing, and they say, hey, we win. And then, you know, look how effective we are. You should join our union and be a member and pay us money so we can keep lobbying for these things that you want. So, I mean, in the end, the likelihood of this happening is just, the reason we have a Fair Work Commission is because politicians don't want to have to deal with this crap, and so we have this kind of compromise situation where the unions don't always get what they want and business don't always get what they want, and they both lobby, and it's a political process, and part of the political process for the Fair Work Commission is just going out into the public to say we want this thing. So I wouldn't be surprised if, like, I'd be genuinely surprised if they thought we are actually going to try and get this thing. I think it's a stunt. It's an effective stunt. It sounds really good. I mean, it's true in the UK. In the UK, they do have this system of 60% of the median wage. So, you know, you never know. I mean, we could end up having. But, I mean, in India, you still got to, like, this could be completely divorced from the actual kind of plan that the ACTU have going forward of how they're actually going to deal with the commission. So, go Vickers, and then we'll wrap up.
I just wanted to point out the fact that you brought up the UK was actually important, and I wanted to bring out the fact that the minimum wage in the UK did not rise during the GFC, right? And that was one of the big complaints of the Tories. And if you think about it, it makes perfect sense that it won't rise, right? Or or it'll even fall because of the way it's tied. If you're statically tying it to the median wage, if the median wage falls, it falls. If the median wage rises, it rises. Now, here's the tricky thing. In Australia, the median, like I suspect, right, and this is why I was hinting at that it's probably a public servant, because that's what happened in the UK, right? The median wage was effectively a public service pay band, and it didn't move, right, which is what's expected in the public service, because there were no renegotiations to put the salary up. So as a result, the minimum wage did not move at all, right? And I think that effect, in my mind, is slightly more favourable than what is currently happening now with the minimum wage being tied to CPI. I suppose, like, my real disagreement would be the fact that it's not pegged at the right percentage. I would say it should be half. It's the minimum
not tied. I should say it's not tied to CPI directly. The Fair Work Commission at the moment, set like, minimum wage.
No. At the moment, the minimum wage is tied to CPI, right?
Not direct. Like the Fair Work Commission will every year will hear submissions and they will say this is the appropriate for this year. They will have regard to CPI, but they're not going to just snap their fingers and say CPI. That's it, right?
Yeah, sure. Okay. Yeah, that's a fair point. No, but
people do often think it's tied to inflation in some way, and it's true. The Fair Work Commission keeps it quite kind of low and conservative in line with what is more or less inflation, but that's not strictly
it's
what
not
it's
legally pegged to it. So they could do what they want, but generally they
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, at that point, let's move on. We've got 15 minutes. All right. So let's talk about let's go with my bugbear because I'm currently hosting. So let's talk about political funding of campaigns. So there was an inquiry in the Senate, and a lobbyist for a business lobby went before and said, above campaigns that involve more than $60 million, all funding should be it should be entirely publicly funded. There should be no private donations whatsoever. So essentially he's calling for the ban of all political donations for federal and I would presume state elections.
Wouldn't that be fantastic for the Labor, Liberal, and Green parties?
I know.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let me just give the rationale.
If we analyse the parties,
let me just quickly give the rationale from this person's perspective. So their thought is that all this shenanigans to do with political donations undermine confidence in the system, and therefore, by limiting the donations, you don't have the problem of potential conflicts or whatever. So that's the rationale. I suspect all of us would agree that's kind of bollocks, but because you go first.
Oh, okay.
Oh, I thought
Look,
you were trying to say something.
If you analyze the political system like a cartel, then you can see that there are three major players in the cartel: the Liberals, the Greens, and the Labor Party. And those three parties are the ones that will control the purse strings. They already do to a great extent. But if public funding is all that's out there, then they will get all the public funding, and they will be the three parties in charge. Absolutely, finally, and determinatively, which really shuts out everyone else from the political system, which is pretty appalling. All right, Vikas, on to you.
Yeah, so it's interesting because it doesn't work ever, right? It never, here's the thing. In Australia, you would expect public funding to increase the number of parties. In fact, that's the justification used. It's just it increases the number of political parties in the political sphere because they're all competing for public money and one can't just ridiculously outspend all the others. But here's the thing. Public funding for politics is granted by, I would consider a merit-based system where you're getting money per vote. Now that would mean the biggest parties with the most votes get most of the money. But in Australia, the really, really stupid thing we do, and I'm legitimately surprised that this hasn't been taken to the High Court of Australia as this is a limiting factor on my freedom of political speech, is that to enter into any seat, you have to give $1,000, right, as a bond to the Australian Electoral Commission. Now, you get that $1,000 back if you secure more than 4% of the vote. Now, that $1,000 is actually a barrier to entry into politics, and it should be treated as such, and there should be a fucking High Court case that says that's fucking unconstitutional.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the weird thing. So the reason that you have that money, and I know I'm pretty sure Anthony Green, who's an ABC election analyst, who particularly is aggrieved by the size of the Senate ballot papers, the size of how big they are. He thinks they should be higher because they essentially have that as a barrier to keep out the weirdos and to keep the ballots that are a reasonable size and all the rest of it. There is this weird thing where they say, we want funding to increase participation, but at the same time they want to keep out low people below us. I mean, essentially it's a restriction on individuals who would run who maybe are a bit crazy.
Yeah, but also but also the unfairness of it is they don't get their money back.
Yeah.
Right? I am happy to accept, hey, you've got a $10,000 bond to run, but you should get it back. Right? You should get it back if you went out and you campaigned and you got at least one vote, even if that's your own vote.
Yeah.
Right? Otherwise it's just $1,000 fee to have your name put on the ballot, right? That is only refundable. Actually, you know what? I would settle if it's not refundable, right? Jack up the rate, make it non-refundable, right? Because right now, it's basically only the major parties that really get their money back.
Yeah, and they get $2 a vote as well. So it's not. I mean,
Yep.
you see things where,
Or better yet, count.
Go.
Yeah, or better yet, I just thought of a better system. You put $10,000 in, and you get $2 per vote, or $10,000, whichever is lower.
Okay. I mean, like,
Well,
you have
how
situations
about-
where
how about-
for years Pauline Hanson was running at every election because she'd crossed that 4% barrier, and at 4% is when you get the $2 a vote. So, you know, if you put in your $1,000, yeah, there'd be a bit of time, but, you know, she was earning $80,000-$90,000 an election, even though she never got in. This is, you know, in the period sort of, after she sort of went to prison and came back, and then up until sort of a couple of years ago where she actually won. And we've seen this resurgence of One Nation. But for a while that she was earning a lot of money just by running in state and federal elections. And Tony Windsor's another one where, you know, he runs against Barnaby. He gets all, you know, he comes second. He gets maybe 30% of the vote. He makes a tidy, you know, $150,000 just for 6 weeks worth of work. So, you know, like there are some weird things. And that would only get worse. Like, I mean, if you actually had public funding, then the parties that run the system would have the justification to say, well, okay, we get $2 a vote now, but we need to replace all this money that we're not getting anymore. And that's,
Yeah.
I mean, I think the news articles I saw were talked about, it was like, you know, $200 million was spent on the last federal election. So that's a lot of taxpayer dollars, you know, going to parties, and they can always rig the system to make it more in their favor. You know, like if,
Yep.
I mean, at least as it is sort of now, you know, like parties, if they raise money, they spend their own money. They've got there's incentive to sort of curtail costs or all the rest of it. Well, they can always just remove all those restrictions, because if you now are just taking taxpayer money, you just come up with a figure that sounds reasonable, but in the end they can just spend whatever the hell they like.
Yep.
Mm.
Last topic.
Yeah, it'll be totally unconstrained, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is appalling.
It is. It's terrible. But, you know, politicians are going to do what... I mean, having said that, this is just a suggestion.
They're really giving up on the idea. It is. But, I mean, the idea, the reason it's gotten so much traction is because the major parties, and I think the Liberals especially, are giving up on the idea of a mass membership party.
Yep.
Okay? And I think that needs to be understood, that people think of these big parties as having active, massive memberships. At least as far as the Liberals are concerned, that's just not the case anymore. Yeah. They're not really interested in getting members. They don't turn away members, but they're not recruiting them. Well, and I know what recruiting is. I think not actively. I mean, I think they were. There was news of like 2 members doing their own thing on their own initiative and recruiting members, and that way getting a power base.
Yeah.
That was in Victoria specifically.
As well.
They recruit at university level almost exclusively.
Yeah, that's fine. And at university level, but it used to be the case that the Liberal Party or quite possibly the Labor Party were, you know, entrenched in the community more widely. Nowadays, I really doubt that you would be able to say, 1 in 10 Australians is a member of a political party. I mean, I really doubt that you would reach that figure, particularly in the major parties. But, I mean, those figures weren't so unrealistic so long ago, a few years ago. That is not a few years ago, but a few decades ago. I think party participation rates were much higher compared to now. I mean, and it strikes me that, I mean, they could really increase membership rates and donations from individuals and become accountable in this way if they wanted to. But I think they've become dependent more on the public dollar. And the reason this is getting more traction in the parties is because it's just easier than becoming accountable to members.
I mean, we have a whole separate discussion of why political parties don't work for members. As somebody who just resigned their membership from the Liberal Party.
We should totally do that as an episode next week.
Yeah. So let's move on to just one.
And I should say, I mean,
Go.
One more very quick thing to say. I mean, I've recruited members of a political party, and I've done it, and it's actually not that hard it's actually quite cheap to do. You know, you could do it for $5 a member if you wanted to, or more maybe. But the point is, it's quite achievable. Anyway, sorry, go on.
So let's go into the ATO. So they have announced that they've a shortfall in their sort of revenue targets by $4.2 $2 billion, according to their 2017 annual report. So
that's not actually that bad. That's about 1% of the budget.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, that's actually quite good. I'm reasonably. I am very impressed by that. If you're only 1% off, that's basically within the margin of error.
Yeah, but what's
that's?
The budget deficit is what?
What was the margin of error, though, Vickers? I'm interested to ask, since you mentioned that it's within the margin of error. What was the margin?
The margin of error typically for most government expenditure is about 2 standard deviations, which is just above 97%, if I recall correctly.
Okay.
So it's So I'm suitably impressed if they got it down to 1%, within 1%.
So plus or minus 3%, but they got it to 1%. That's what you're saying.
Yeah. So usually I'm saying usually they go within 2 standard deviations, but they might. I don't know. It's a conservative government, so they might actually go for 3 standard deviations. So if it's 3 standard deviations, then it's 98.7 or something like that. In which case, it's still impressive because that's within 1.3%, and they've got it at the lower end of that. Yeah.
I mean, having said that, when you're talking about a budget deficit of, like $35 billion, it's not an insignificant amount of money. It's like 10% of the budget deficit. For the revenue targets.
Sure, but look, here's the thing. How much... it's an informational question, right? So... now, the reason why Costello was good with this is because he would find what that margin of error was, and he would then double it and cut revenue by that much, right? To account, to sort of soften the blow of that. No, there's plenty of people who were around PM&C and Treasury around at the time who can explain this methodology better than I can. But basically, the genius of Costello was that he just assumed that the Treasury would get it wrong, right? And gave himself enough of a wiggle room to sort of just go, well, if they fuck up by this much, if they fuck up worse than this, I should be fine. Now, what that tells me is Scott Morrison's an idiot and doesn't know how to build a...
no one has any doubt about that one.
Yeah. So, like, if it's 1% of the budget, so $4 billion is 1% of the budget, I would have built a safety net of at least $8 billion in expenditure.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah.
Except that they can't because they're desperate. I mean, Costello can do that in a time when, you're absolutely cleaning up, like when you're in the middle of a boom, when things are going really well.
Well, hang on. But politically, like in 1998, they came in with a 96. Sorry, they had 96-seat majority, right? Which was the largest majority a government had ever seen. At the end of 1998, they'd been obliterated, right?
Sure.
They were down to I think it was 81 seats, right? They had a very small majority, and they were very negative in the polls all the way from, because they just brought in the GST, and Kim Beazley was just going ballistic about, we're going to repeal the GST, right? But he still, for those 3 years, from 1998 to 2001, when there was strong negative polling against the Liberal Party, right, he built in that slack.
Just got to move the...
Yeah. He built... Sorry, I'm just saying, he built in that slack, right?
Yeah.
And it takes... I think part of being a good treasurer is basically, A, telling the Prime Minister, rack off, we don't have the money, and B, telling all the ministers, I don't have any money to give you either, cunts.
Yep. Well,
right?
and that was... And I mean, I think it's pretty safe to say that Scott Morrison is not Peter Costello. But I think you just also... at the point, I mean, you look at some of the things they come up with to like try and find more revenue, and you're like, they literally are like the policy equivalent of like lifting the catch up to see if there's any change underneath. Like they really, for a lot of the proproposals they have to find revenue.
Really just grabbing the taxpayer and shaking them if they can.
Because I mean, most of the big, like all big ticket reforms off the table because they're too gutless, and all big, there's no source of big revenue you can just sort of easily raid that pie and say, well, we're going to take that. So they just sort of. They don't want to go for anything too controversial because they've got maybe not even a 1-seat majority if what's his name turns out John Alexander turns out to be a non-citizen or dual citizens or whatever. They're not in the mood for like radical change, and so if $4 billion, just to say, they should have this bigger sort of buffer. I just don't see them doing it. If I was in Scott Morrison's position, I'd be like setting fire to Treasury itself and saying, let it burn down. But, say I was Scott Morrison, not, anarchist. Like, I'm not sure I'd be inclined to sort of try to have more wiggle room. I think I'd want it down to the last dollar and having an increasing amount of revenue. So,
if I was
I must say, I mean, if you look at it historically, a $4 billion shortfall is compared to previous governments and previous budgets. I mean, previous budgets, the shortfall was in the tens of billions at times, and a $4 billion shortfall it's almost cause for celebration. My goodness, it's like, well, it's only $4 billion. The figure still boggles the mind. Its enormity. We still can't comprehend it as human beings. But even so, we can do the 4. We can compare it to 10 and 20 and 30, and we can say, well, this is less.
Yep. It's an improvement for sure.
For whatever that's worth.
Yeah. So
final word, Vic.
But like I said,
wrap up.
Yeah. So just coming back to it, I look. If I was Scott Morrison, I would get used to saying no, but I already like saying no. So, it's the Ron Swanson thing. He's just got to get used to saying no to people. And I think if he does, these things won't matter in the slightest in future. Like, hey, ATO has had a revenue shortfall of $10 billion. That's fine. I've got a $20 billion buffer.
Yeah.
So we still end up $10 billion ahead.
So you're saying that the Treasurer needs to be more conservative, basically.
He needs to start running it like a business. That would be my advice.
All right, and with that, we're going to have to wrap things up. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in, listening. Thanks to Vickers and Steve for joining us. We'll be back here next week with more discussion. Actually, this Thursday, we're, at least Vickers and myself, with maybe Eve as well, we're having a discussion with Dave Allenson, who's part of the Recognise campaign. I've forgotten the exact title, but yeah, we're going to be talking about Indigenous recognition in the Constitution and the voice to Parliament and things like that. So be ready for a episode later in the week, which will go through some of that. So thanks for joining us, and yeah, we'll be back again next week.
See ya.